The U.S. is taking control of Venezuela's oil, and why this matters more than you think. Some things don't arrive with alarms, they don't interrupt your phone, they don't dominate headlines, and they don't feel urgent at first. But quietly, they begin to change how power works. Something like that just happened involving the United States and Venezuela's oil. And it could affect millions of people, including Americans, long before most realize what's happening. At first glance, this looks like another foreign policy decision, another distant dispute, another country far away. But this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about who controls resources, who sets the rules, and how trust between nations is changing. And it's about why people are angry, even if they can't fully explain it yet. The U.S. government has moved to decide how Venezuelan oil is sold and where the money goes, not by invading, not by officially taking ownership, but by asserting control over the process itself. Who can buy the oil, under what conditions, and how the revenue is handled. That may sound technical. It isn't. Oil isn't just a commodity. It's leverage. For decades, control over oil has meant influence, over prices, over supply chains, over political decisions. When one country gains that control over another, it changes the balance. And people around the world notice, even if they don't say it out loud. In the United States, many people are asking a simple question. Why does this matter to me? The answer isn't obvious yet, but it starts with how oil moves through the global system. Oil doesn't just fuel cars. It affects transportation costs, food prices, manufacturing, heating, electricity. When control over supply changes, the ripple effects travel quickly and quietly, and when governments intervene directly, markets react in ways that don't always show up immediately. That's why energy analysts are paying close attention, not because of what the U.S. said publicly, but because of what this move signals privately. This isn't the first time the United States has used oil as a tool of policy. Sanctions have done this for years, but this is different. Sanctions restrict access. Control reshapes ownership of decisions, and that distinction matters. In Venezuela, oil isn't just an industry. It's the backbone of the economy. When decisions about oil sales move outside the country, it affects wages, services, stability, and daily life. That's why reactions there are intense. People feel stripped of agency. Even those who oppose their own government feel uneasy about outside control. But the reaction isn't limited to Venezuela. Other governments are watching closely, including Canada. Canada depends heavily on stable global energy markets, not just for exports, but for price stability, investment planning, and long-term economic decisions. When the U.S. takes direct control of another country's oil flow, it raises uncomfortable questions. Questions like, who decides next and under what conditions? This is where emotion enters the story, because people don't just react to outcomes, they react to precedent. For Americans, this decision touches something deeper. There's pride in leadership, but also fatigue. Many people feel the country is constantly carrying global responsibility, often without clear benefit at home. Others worry that these actions create more instability, not less. That's why reactions are so divided, and why anger doesn't always have a single direction. Some see this as strength, others see it as overreach, but almost everyone senses that the rules are changing. What's especially striking is how quiet the global response has been. No dramatic summits, no emergency speeches, just careful statements, diplomatic language, and quiet adjustments behind the scenes. That's usually a sign something serious is happening. When governments don't rush to comment, it often means they're recalculating, looking at risks, running scenarios, asking uncomfortable questions. Because this isn't only about Venezuela's oil, it's about whether global norms are shifting, about whether powerful countries are moving from influence to direct control, and about how other nations respond when that line blurs. For allies, this creates a dilemma. Support the U.S. publicly, but privately prepare alternatives. That tension is becoming more common, and it's reshaping international relationships. This is why this story matters more than it seems. Not because of one decision, but because of what it reveals about power, about trust, and about the direction the global system may be moving. In the next part, we'll look more closely at how this decision affects the United States at home, why energy markets are uneasy, and why some officials are worried about long-term consequences, even if they aren't saying so publicly. Because the most important effects of this move haven't happened yet. They're still forming. What this means for America, and why people are uneasy. To understand why this decision is unsettling, it helps to look inward, at what it means for the United States itself. Because this isn't just a foreign policy move. It's a signal about how America now uses power. For years, U.S. leaders have spoken about stability, about rules-based order, about predictability, about trust. Those ideas matter because markets, allies, and ordinary people plan their lives around them. When rules feel stable, people invest, they hire, they take risks. When rules feel flexible or selective, anxiety grows. That anxiety is starting to show. Energy markets don't panic loudly anymore. They hesitate. They price in uncertainty quietly. And uncertainty almost always costs consumers more over time. Most Americans won't see a sudden spike and connect it to Venezuela, but they may notice things slowly getting tighter, transportation costs creeping up, food prices staying high longer than expected, businesses hesitating to expand. These effects don't arrive with labels. They just accumulate. There's also a deeper concern many people struggle to articulate, a feeling that the country is acting without fully explaining why, that decisions with global consequences are happening far from public debate, and that makes people uneasy, even those who support strong U.S. leadership. This is where emotion enters politics. People don't just want strength. They want clarity. They want to know what the plan is and how long it lasts. For decades, American power worked best when it felt predictable. Allies knew the boundaries. Markets knew the rules. Adversaries knew the costs. When power becomes more improvisational, even allies start adjusting, not loudly, but carefully. This is why officials in other countries are paying such close attention, not because they oppose the United States, but because they're trying to understand how decisions are being made and whether similar actions could affect them next. Canada, in particular, watches moments like this closely. Its economy is deeply tied to the U.S. Its energy markets are interconnected. Its political stability depends on predictability south of the border. When the U.S. asserts control over another country's oil flow, it raises questions Canada can't ignore, not ideological questions, practical ones. What happens when control replaces coordination? What happens when economic pressure becomes structural power? And how should a neighboring country plan its future in that environment? These are not abstract debates inside Ottawa. They affect long-term planning, from energy investment to trade alignment. And they quietly influence how close countries want to be to any single decision maker. This is where credibility becomes the central issue. Not military credibility, economic credibility. The belief that rules will be applied consistently, not just when convenient. When credibility weakens, countries don't protest. They diversify. They build options. They reduce exposure. That's exactly what many governments are doing right now. For Americans, this creates a paradox. The country remains incredibly powerful, yet its partners are planning as if that power might come with uncertainty. That's not decline, but it is change. And change brings tension, because power used decisively can solve problems. But power used without explanation can create new ones. People sense this tension even if they don't follow foreign policy. They feel it as frustration, as fatigue, as the sense that the world feels more unstable on it without knowing exactly why. That's why this story resonates emotionally. It taps into a deeper concern. Are we shaping the future or reacting to it? And that question matters because once countries adjust their behavior, reversing course is hard. Systems adapt, habits form, expectations change. In the final part, we'll look beyond immediate reactions and focus on the long view. How this move fits into a larger pattern, what it signals about America's role going forward, and whether this kind of power actually brings more stability or quietly undermines it. Because the real impact of this decision won't be measured in days, it will be measured in how the world responds over years. In the next part, we'll look more closely at how this decision affects the United States at home, why energy markets are uneasy, and why some officials are worried about long-term consequences, even if they aren't saying so publicly, because the most important effects of this move haven't happened yet. They're still forming. What this signals about power, and where this could lead. When you step back from the details, a larger pattern starts to emerge. This isn't an isolated decision. It's part of a broader shift in how power is being exercised and how it's being perceived. For much of the modern era, American influence worked because it felt indirect. The U.S. didn't need to control everything. It shaped outcomes by setting rules, coordinating allies, and offering stability. That model relied on trust, and trust depends on consistency. What's different now is that power feels more immediate, more hands-on, more transactional. That can be effective in the short term, but over time, it changes how others behave. When countries see direct control used as a tool, they don't necessarily push back publicly. They adapt privately. They look for ways to reduce vulnerability, to build alternatives, to avoid being on the wrong side of a future decision. That's not rebellion. It's self-preservation. This is where the long-term consequences begin to form. Because once countries build parallel systems, whether in energy, trade, or security, they rarely dismantle them. They become insurance policies, and insurance once purchased is hard to give up. For the United States, this creates a quiet dilemma. Exerting control can solve immediate problems, but it can also encourage others to move just far enough away to protect themselves, not enough to break ties, but enough to weaken influence. This is why some officials worry that moments like this don't announce themselves as turning points. They reveal themselves later, when coordination takes longer, when allies hesitate, when negotiations feel more cautious than they used to. For Canada, this raises especially sensitive questions. Canada depends on cooperation more than confrontation, on predictability more than power. When global rules feel flexible, smaller economies feel the impact first, not through headlines, but through planning, investment decisions, trade alignment, energy strategy. Canada doesn't need to oppose the U.S. to quietly rethink how exposed it wants to be. And that kind of recalibration is already happening. For Americans, the implications are more personal than they may appear. Global influence affects domestic life. It shapes economic stability, job creation, cost of living. When uncertainty grows abroad, it almost always finds its way home. This is why people feel unsettled, even if they can't trace the feeling to a single policy. There's a sense that the world feels less anchored, less predictable, and that feeling matters, because public trust doesn't erode all at once. It fades slowly. Some will argue that decisive action is necessary in a chaotic world. Others will argue that restraint creates more stability. The truth is more complicated. Power works best when it's understood, not just enforced. This moment raises a question that goes beyond Venezuela, beyond oil, beyond any one administration. It asks what kind of leadership actually holds in a changing world. Is it leadership that controls outcomes directly, or leadership that convinces others to move willingly in the same direction? That question doesn't have an easy answer, but it's one the United States and its partners are now quietly grappling with, because the world isn't waiting. It's adjusting, slowly, carefully, without announcements. And the most important changes aren't happening on television. They're happening in planning rooms, in investment decisions, in conversations that never become public. This is why this story matters more than it seems, not because of what happened today, but because of what it suggests about tomorrow. Power doesn't disappear, it evolves. And whether that evolution strengthens the United States or slowly narrows its influence depends on how these moments are handled, not just with strength, but with foresight. If this story felt heavier than expected, that's because it is. And it's worth paying attention to what comes next, because once the world starts planning differently, it rarely goes back. And that question matters because once countries adjust their behavior, reversing course is hard. Systems adapt, habits form, expectations change. In the final part, we'll look beyond immediate reactions and focus on the long view. How this move fits into a larger pattern, what it signals about America's role going forward, and whether this kind of power actually brings more stability or quietly undermines it. Because the real impact of this decision won't be measured in days, it will be measured in how the world responds over years. In the next part, we'll look more closely at how this decision affects the United States at home, why energy markets are uneasy, and why some officials are worried about long-term consequences, even if they aren't saying so publicly, because the most important effects of this move haven't happened yet. They're still forming.